Thanks, Albert. And our dear friend Ruth Mizell put us together. Ruth is with the Lord after about 98 years of life on this planet, and Albert and I became fast friends, and we've been at NRBs together, and it's amazing when he and I come together, all of a sudden people start showing up. It's just amazing how God does that. It all has to do with Israel, and all has to do with the work that Albert's doing, the work that we're doing. And it's been an honor and privilege to be involved with the prayer breakfast since 2017. I met my wife at the Jerusalem prayer breakfast in Brazil in 2022. About a year after my wife had passed, I had no intention or no plan to get married. I was still in grieving, but a dear friend of mine said, "You're about to get married." And this lady, when she hears the Lord, she hears the Lord. But the Lord said, "You're not going to the prayer breakfast unless you're invited." I said, "Lord, I've been involved since 2017, but it was loud and clear, you're not going unless you're invited." So Allison Griffin called me, and Peter, they met at the first prayer breakfast as a young couple, and they had gotten married. And they said they were praying on the weekend, and that but I am to join them in Brazil. I said, "Okay, there's my answer, Lord." And Tanya had a very prophetic friend that had said, "Your husband's coming from the United States," explained what I looked like, my age, my hair color, and even the color of the tie that I'd be wearing. And when I walked in the bus, I looked and I said, "Oh gosh, all the guys in this bus have ties on. I better go get my tie." And all of a sudden someone jumped up and says, "That'd be a great idea." It's Tanya. So I walked on the bus with my pink silk tie, and she jumped up and said, "I love your tie." I'm going, I've never been complimented quite like that about my tie. So so we met at the prayer breakfast in Brazil. Tanya and I started working on attempting to persuade President Bolsonaro. We were there for the election with Albert and others. We were there for the election, and I was on the way back to Jerusalem with Albert. I was going to be here for about 10 days. So Tanya and I started working on attempting to convince President Bolsonaro to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Brazil before he left office in a couple months. And Ambassador Friedman, the best ambassador the United States has ever had in Israel, said that within 36 hours of the election of October 30, 2022, that if President Bolsonaro had moved the embassy, he would have been reelected. And I said to Albert, "Wow, Albert, this is a diplomatic ambassador. We have to go see him." So Albert picked up the phone, called Ambassador Friedman, because I was curious, why did he say it so soon after an election? So Albert and I went over and met with Ambassador Friedman, and he said that because President Trump, when he spoke in the United States about moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the applause that he would receive for that was much greater than anything else President Trump had done as president. Much more than anything else. And he told the pastors, Pastor JPB, who was the host of the prayer breakfast, and other pastors from Brazil when they were visiting Israel, that's what President Bolsonaro needs to do. He needs to move the embassy. So, that was very powerful. So we went back, we had a meeting set up. Tanya, myself, and Pastor JB went and sat with the Bolsonaros for 1 hour, attempting to convince them to move the embassy. But first of all, we talked about how much the Jewish and Christians in America appreciated President Bolsonaro and their strong, and Mrs. Bolsonaro's strong stand for the faith. And then we talked about the members of Congress, the Republicans that are so supportive of Israel. And then we tried to persuade him to move the embassy. And he said that was his plan. But then he'd even picked an ambassador, but then the coronavirus happened. And so that stalled out his plans. And then he said, "I can't handle the pressure. I can't take any more. We got a couple countries. If we have a civil unrest here, Argentina, Chile, Venezuela, Colombia has offered to send in troops. I'm dealing with health issues. if we have a terrorism event here in Brazil, I just can't do it. But what happened is in this process of Tanya and I working together, we started understanding that we think so alike politically, and the rest is history. Pastor Ramiro Pena, who spoke this morning, married us in Waco, Texas in February, and we have been boldly continuing to stand for the state of Israel ever since. But my standing from Israel goes all the way back to 2001. My first book, Israel, the Blessing and the Curse, I documented what happens when we put pressure on Israel to divide their land. John McTernan and I wrote the book, and what was so interesting, we were doing everything we could to get that book published and on the street in late August, and we had one thing after another happen where we couldn't get it done. And then 9/11 happened. A week later, we had our book on the streets of America. It was selling. It became a national bestseller immediately. What we found and what we added to Israel, the Blessing and the Curse was the fact that President George Bush had been working with Crown Prince bin Salman for 17 straight days because the Crown Prince Abdullah had thought that President Trump was now siding with Israel, despite the close family relations with the Bushes and the Crown Prince and Prince Bandar. He was furious. So Colin Powell and a few others at the State Department convinced them that you have to do something to get the Crown Prince back in favor. That was the two-state plan. They worked 17 straight days on this deal, or this plan that was going to be introduced to the UN at the end of September 2001. On 9/10, the work was completed. Prince Bandar was in his mansion in McLean, Virginia, celebrating. He was euphoric. He was so excited about this plan that was going to be introduced, the two-state plan, Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security. And the next day, Bandar woke up to the horror of the fact that 15 of the 19 terrorists were Saudis. The God of Israel did not produce the evil of 9/11, but he did not stop it. Just like he didn't produce the evil of October 7. In Israel, he didn't stop it for Israel's security. To deal with Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. Michelle Bachmann and I in 2019, warned President Trump's administration, Secretary of State Pompeo, Kushner, and Greenblatt at the State Department. Michelle was at the State Department. We met with my book, Eye to Eye, Facing the Consequences of Dividing Israel, with 15 Christian leaders, Jack Graham, Marcus Lamb, Jensen Franklin, Paula White, and warned them. Michelle warned them, if President Trump goes forward with this peace plan, it could cost him the election. And then we met with Paula White that night and her husband at the Trump International and told Paula, and even Michelle went as far as, this will cost President Trump the election if he goes forward with this plan. A few weeks later, first week in April, Jared Kushner, who many Christians were afraid to cross Jared Kushner because they would lose their access to the White House, presented his plan, and we had, let me finish this. Paula White said, I need a summary of your book, 3-4 page summary. And I said, I'll even add every American president back to Woodrow Wilson in their relationship with the Jewish people, or the state of Israel, those that were blessed and those that were cursed. And I submitted that, and 5 weeks later, Kushner had his plan, and so it was Paula and Jensen and John Hagee, Joe Rosenberg, and Lance Wallnau and others, all friends of Israel. But the Kushner plan was released, and no one opposed it directly, and they went forward. But we continued to work hard, bringing information together. And then January 28, 2020 happened. President Trump introduced the Peace to Prosperity Plan. The Peace to Prosperity Plan had a map associated with it. President Trump's administration put the map on the Twitter page. It had over 68 million followers. Within 40 minutes, we had a 7.7 earthquake shake the Miami financial district. Usually they come in hot and then they drop the number. They come in at 7, then they'll drop to 6. Come in at 7, 8, it'll drop to 6.5. This one came in at 7.3 and was raised to 7.7. I said, thanks, Lord. And then that afternoon, Peter Navarro, White House counselor, told Fauci and Health Secretary Azar in Mulvaney that we have a crisis coming to America. This was in a few hours of President Trump presenting really the Kushner plan that he developed, the deal of the century. And Fauci said, we're gonna lose 1 million lives and it's gonna cost us $3.5 trillion. He was talking about coronavirus. They laughed at him, and he left the White House, and the next day he put that in a memo and warned them, exact terms. Within 48 hours, every major leader of the world talked about, no, they have their two-state plan. Bush has his, we have ours. 7 weeks later, 3 billion people in the world were in a lockdown because of coronavirus. I wrote a commentary, Life in America Before January 28 and Life in America After January 28. Things significantly changed when President Trump came forward with his plan. And down at the Houston Jerusalem prayer breakfast, I talked to Chief of Staff Mark Meadows because Michelle and I thought that we couldn't get through Meadows, because Meadows is not going to take something to Trump. He's going to go to Kushner to get to Trump. He will not risk the ire of Kushner. And we worked hard and did everything we could to get this to the White House. Be careful, be careful. And then we had the summer of the Abraham Accords, some of the largest, most ferocious hurricanes in U.S. history. All were mapping the exact days they were working on the Abraham Accord. Then on September 15, 2020, at the White House lawn at noon, President Trump, Prime Minister Netanyahu, the leader of Bahrain, the leader of Emirates signed the Abraham Accords. It was interesting as Netanyahu was arriving at the White House, on the Fox News screen down in the corner was this massive hurricane called Sally. That was the news for the day, the signing of the Abraham Accords in this massive hurricane called Sally. And one of my readers that lives in New York City said, Bill, you realize the Hebrew name for Sally is Sarah. So in other words, Hurricane Sarah was slamming into the southern Gulf Coast a few hours after the Abraham Accords was signed. That could have been called any one of our names. But God was saying no. The land's for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants. No leader has the right to divide the covenant land of Israel or create an Arab state in Judea and Samaria. So we know what happened with the U.S. election. Well, one other thing. 72 hours after Netanyahu signed the Abraham Accords at the White House, Israel went into a 3-week lockdown for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot, costing 5 billion shekels. Exactly what they were to receive in their first year of the accord, 5 billion shekels. The election, we watched the disruption of the U.S. election. Fauci convinced President Trump, if you come forward with a plan to knock out COVID, you will win by a landslide. They worked hard, so hard with Pfizer, Moderna, with their mRNA vaccine, which is so controversial in its own regard. And the election happened, and then 1 week after the election, Pfizer announced they had a plan with their vaccine, and then Moderna. So Trump didn't get any political help for that. He actually was costly to his election or re-election. So we know what happened with the election. The 6 swing states, there was a cumulative votes of about 40,000. I grew up in Arizona. I know that political system. Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Important swing states that President Trump won in this last 2024 election. President Trump obviously is the man of the hour, and I spoke recently in Orlando, Florida, and I said, you know, I was burdened because President Trump wasn't reelected in 2020. But I know that he is elected. This is God's timing for him to be elected, 2024. This is God's time. For better, for worse, he is going to further accelerate final day events. In November, I wrote about Trump's Middle East team. Kushner, Steve Witkoff, Mossad Boulos, and also Musk had been meeting with the Iranian foreign minister to the UN. And the Lord says they're going to look at the Middle East as a business plan and not a covenant plan. And I wrote an article about the 4 billionaires, I don't know if they're all billionaires, but the 4 billionaires that are influencing President Trump's Middle East efforts. And then he selects Steve Witkoff to be his Middle East envoy. Steve is really our Secretary of State, but he didn't have to go through the hearings that qualifies you to be the Secretary of State. Steve Witkoff came and pushed hard on a Hamas-Israel hostage deal. And my friends here in Israel, Orthodox and conservatives, were very fearful of that deal, and we were too. Witkoff's in Qatar. Well, Qatar had bought out his $625 million hotel in Manhattan that, using a real estate term, was underwater. He was negotiating with Qatar, and as he's flying from Qatar to Jerusalem to meet with Netanyahu, a polar vortex spreads across America, and 95% of America was in a deep freeze, and President Trump canceled the inauguration. And he met with Benjamin Netanyahu and said, I don't care if it's Shabbat or not, you're going to take this deal. You'll be the first foreign minister to the White House, and we'll make sure some of those weapons that have been frozen will be unfrozen. Netanyahu accepted, all but accepted a deal that he refused under Biden. And then at the NRB convention in late February, the NRB, ICEJ, and Israel Allies Caucus, Josh Reinstein's group, signed an agreement calling on President Trump to declare Judea and Samaria to be Israel's sovereign right. It hasn't happened. We're continuing to pray for it. But I have just a little bit of time here. I'll zip through this pretty quick. President Trump, in the title of mine, is President Trump's Middle East trip and the impact on Israel and the United States. A couple concerns here. And I didn't write anything up right after the trip because I was processing and praying about it. And it was interesting, Tanya and myself, Tanya writes commentary as well, we both sensed it wasn't about the land at this moment, but was the fact that we're opening our borders to Islam. When you cut $1 trillion deal, basically as T. Boone Pickens would say, that's $500 billion a year from the U.S. goes to the Middle East. It's basically our money that's coming back in the United States through the Saudis, through the Emirates, through the Qataris. But my commentary was President Trump's endorsement of the Saudis, the Qataris, and the Emirates. And we all know about the history of these 3 countries. Emirates is more of a business deal. They're a lot more easy to deal with. It's the Saudis, and especially the Qataris and the Saudis. So we are throwing open the borders to radical Islam. We have members of the Trump administration that have been receiving money from Qatar for a fair amount of time. And radical Islam, they're buying and building mosques all across the country, in Texas, Maryland, Michigan, and other states. And then to finish, 2 things. President Trump believes that Witkoff is close to doing a hostage deal with Hamas and Israel, and that Iran's close to agreeing to a peace deal. Iran are brilliant, masterful, three-dimensional chess players. And that, I've seen it, and that's also according to friends of mine that work in the Israeli embassy in Washington. These guys are master negotiators. But President Trump has put pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu. Don't go in and hit them. April 7th in the White House, Netanyahu was blindsided and says, don't attack Iran. He knew it was close. Benjamin Netanyahu was coming to the White House to explain his plan, but he said, no, no, no. And then just yesterday, Kristi Noem was here this week to represent Trump and to tell Netanyahu that the United States and Israel need to be on the same page. It was a warning. And then yesterday, President Trump was asked about Israel responding on their own, and he all but says, no, it's not gonna happen. We don't want it to happen. It shouldn't happen, and we're getting close to cutting a deal with Iran. Within a few hours, a 3-person federal court in New York City declared his tariff plan to be illegal. This is his economic plan, that it's illegal. And also, this will disrupt, according to Bloomberg, not necessarily a conservative friend, but a good news service, said that this is going to create economic disruption. Well, anytime a president of the United States starts working on the covenant land, we see disruption, political, atmospheric, or otherwise. And also, he called Putin crazy. President Trump called Putin crazy a couple days ago, and then Medvedev, the former president of Russia, warned President Trump, we don't want World War III. So that's what's happened in the 48 to 72 hours since Kristi Noem went back to Washington from her warning of President Trump. So anyhow, we are living in the most important biblical time in history. We continue to look at Jerusalem and the state of Israel as God's time clock. As Ambassador Huckabee said today, let's continue to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And what a blessing it is to live at a day like this when we see the Jewish prophets and our Messiah, Yeshua, in the Olivet Discourse, speak of the day that we're living in. We can't even begin to comprehend how blessed we are. But yes, let's continue to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Thank you.